We're delighted to welcome you to the second session of the day. The festival is protected by Dettol. It's a pleasure to present today Unruly Waves from the South, Sujit Sivasundaram and Sunil Amrith in conversation. Cambridge academic Sujit Sivasundaram traces forgotten histories along the coast and islands of the India and Pacific Oceans in waves across the South. A new history of revolution and empire offering a new understanding of the making of a world and insisting particularly on the significance of the environment. Astutely observed and creatively written, the British-Sri Lankan writer looks at the perspective of indigenous populations and their efforts to assert identity as the British Empire drove unexpected change. In Unruly Waters, Yale historian and MacArthur Fellow Sunil Amrith reimagines Asia's history through the stories of its rains, rivers, coast and seas by tying these narratives with efforts to reshape nature through dams and pumps that have unleashed ramifications within and between nations. Together, they shine a light on an often ignored integral part of global history. Sujit Sivasundaram. Sujit is Professor of World History at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge. He is also Director of the Centre of South Asian Studies, Cambridge. His previous books include Islanded, Britain, Sri Lanka and the Bounds of an Indian Ocean Colony. Sunil Amrith. Sunil is a Professor of History at Yale University. He is the author of 4 books, including Crossing the Bay of Bengal and Unruly Waters. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section on your screens. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting Unruly Waves from the South, Sujit Sivasundaram and Sunil Amrith in conversation. Enjoy the session.
Thank you very much. Well, we were emailing actually just before this event, and I'm delighted to be here. And certainly our books cover slightly different periods and present different approaches, but they're both about water. And so what we thought we would do is to actually begin by reflecting on why we decided to write on water, and also how water provides a route into the broader claims of our books, both Waves Across the South and Unruly Waters. So I've got Unruly Waters here, and Waves Across the South as well. So yeah, we're just going to first begin on that. So Sunil, would you like to say something about how water provides a route into the argument and why you decided to focus in on it?
As you know, Sujit, I mean, there are so many moments when our work has sort of intersected, and there's sort of, I see the projects as very braided in many ways, and that there have been these moments of interconnection and convergence. And before Unruly Waters, I wrote a book called Crossing the Bay of Bengal. And that began very much as a history of migration. That didn't initially have an environmental history dimension to it at all. And it was really over the course of thinking about migration and mobility, particularly between India and Southeast Asia, that I guess I became increasingly curious about the materiality of that movement. And I realized that in a lot of oceanic history, and this is something I know you've written about as well, the ocean itself is often simply a space of transit. And I realized that that had been true of the way that I started thinking about the project. But by the time I sort of got to the end of that work, I became increasingly interested in the water itself. And I think that was the moment when I realized that water was what tied together histories of agrarian transformation with climate, with mobility and immobility. And that's what opened the horizon for me as far as Unruly Waters was concerned. But I mean, in a sense, water has been central to your work throughout. I mean, going back to your earliest work on the Pacific, thinking about Islanded and what it means not only to write the history of Sri Lanka, but indeed to write the history of an island in global history. And then we have Waves Across the South. So what was your path to thinking about water and oceans in the way that you have?
Yeah, sure. So with Waves Across the South, I thought quite a lot about the title of the book, which maybe we'll get onto as well, because it's interesting that you have the title Unruly Waters too. And so the idea was to actually use the object of the wave itself. Having grown up in Sri Lanka, watching waves was very much part of my upbringing. And so I thought, what would it be like to actually organize a book around the subject of waves? And then I realized the book is about the late 18th and the early 19th century waves across the South, that in fact waves are really significant in this era, because if you transit from the sea to the land, at the point of crossing, a whole series of things can go wrong. So ships can be wrecked. If there's war, things can go wrong close to coral reefs. People can be washed aboard and so forth. So really kind of thinking about the dangers associated with crossing from sea to land around the object of the wave then became a way of really conceiving of this whole period of the late 18th and the early 19th century. So it was an idea that was in my mind, partly because I grew up in Sri Lanka. But in fact, I thought, actually, this is an interesting way of organizing the whole history and actually sort of beginning with the wave. And if one thinks in those terms, then, which are more environmentalist terms for writing history, one has to be aware really of the power of nature, the unpredictability of nature, the violence of human engagements with nature in their unpredictability. And so those are some of the themes that I wanted to highlight in Waves Across the South as central to the period. And certainly those were ones that I was aware of as well in my earlier work, which you kindly mentioned. So I landed to, I have this image in mind, which I don't have with me, of the pearl fishery, with loads of ships arriving at the pearl fishery between Sri Lanka and India. And really this tortured stretch of water, which has carried on being tortured through the course of the Civil War as well, with quite bloodied, in fact, being really central as a way of kind of rethinking the histories of these territories. And once again, the uncertainty of the watery medium as a way of opening up this history. I mean, I guess one of the things that I was struck by, Sunil, in reading Unruly Waters was really human engagement with the medium of water and how there are so many desires and fears that come to play a part. And this was a running theme of your book. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, because I guess if water is unpredictable, humans respond in certain ways to it. And I guess in that dynamic opens up some of the problems that lead into perhaps the climate crisis today.
Absolutely. I mean, I think for me, one of the realizations and then one of the arguments of the book was the sense that, in fact, dreams and fears connected with water were really quite central to imaginations of the future in many parts of South and indeed Southeast Asia. I mean, I write mostly about India in the book, but I think this is probably more broadly true that particularly from the 19th century, really from the period where our books sort of overlap to some extent, where you finish and I begin. I mean, from that moment onwards, I think there are so many schemes to channel water, to control water, to understand water. And I'd started thinking about that in maritime terms. I'd started thinking about the monsoons in relation to Indian Ocean connections, in relation to sailing routes. That led me to an interest in cyclones, because of course, talking about danger, that was one of the real dangers of this period of waves and indeed of storms. And then increasingly, I started to connect that with what had, in my mind at least, been a sort of separate set of interventions, which were interventions on land, interventions that had been written about, really by historians of agriculture. This, canals, dams, groundwater, all of which are very much at play already in the 19th century. This is not just a 20th century story, and some of the most intensive British schemes to reshape the landscape of India had to do with water. And I think we can see this longue durée intersection, I think, between water's own rhythms, water's own chronology, which is episodic or cyclical, which includes unpredictability really sort of as a core part of a climate system like the monsoon. And I suppose a human desire to make water legible, predictable, and ultimately controllable. But I mean, I was struck reading Waves Across the South in your ability to really sort of identify, I think, some of the moments when there was a fundamental shift in perspective that came with colonial science, with colonial scientists. And interestingly, one of the sites that I think our books share is the Madras Observatory. And I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about the story that you tell connected with the Madras Observatory and how you do see that in some ways as pivotal.
Yeah, sure. So I've actually got an image to share in a moment, actually, about of the Madras Observatory. But I think we should pick up this point about periodization, because you also mentioned a multiplier effect, in a sense, how things ramp up as we go through the 19th and the 20th century in terms of water management and water engineering. And so my book is really, as Sunil says, about the earlier period of the late 18th and the early 19th century, the so-called Age of Revolutions. And one of the points of the book was really to open up the Age of Revolutions as a concept in a new way in this watery geography. Here we have, I hope you can see it, an image of a wave breaking in Madras, just getting to the point really about the unpredictability of the wave and the work that needs to be undertaken here by people of color in unloading passengers from a British ship, which you can see in the distance. And here, once again, the unpredictability of the wave as horses from Australia are landed in Madras in the 1830s, once again highlighting certainly the racial dimensions of labor with the colonial officer in the foreground, exerting discipline over animals and humans in turn. And since Sunil mentioned the Madras Observatory, this is the Madras Observatory here. And what's afoot here in the 1820s is something called a pendulum length experiment. And so we have a so-called British observer, it's more complicated, in the foreground, and two Tamil Brahmin pundits, and they're trying to measure really the time that it takes for a pendulum to swing from side to side, because when you calculate this, you can calculate in turn the curvature of the Earth, because gravitational acceleration changes from side to side on the Earth, and the Earth isn't a perfect sphere. Now, the point about Madras Observatory, and this is now the link with Sunil's book, is that there's a huge amount of data crunching that goes on here. And I was actually quite surprised in taking out the documents connected to the Madras Observatory, which begins from the 1780s and runs into this early 19th century moment and beyond. Just lines and lines of stats. And these statistics could be about tide, they could be about temperature, they could be about, yeah, certainly the winds, and surveying of all kinds, and things like this as well, which we were just mentioning, the pendulum length experiments. And so it's a kind of data crunching machine, which is multidisciplinary. And as it proceeds, this data crunching machine, it's imperial, of course, as well. And the imperialism relies then on humans just being able to extract themselves out of nature, to model nature in new ways. The Earth itself is being modeled here. And winds and the monsoon, certainly, and this is a link with Sunil's work, are being modeled too. And so the extraction is central really to the imperial program. And what I argue for the period, because the period is the Age of Revolutions, is that data is central to counter-revolution, meaning that there are all kinds of possibilities open for Tamil Brahmin pundits. For astronomers, the astronomer in the front of the image was in fact probably Danish in origin, though he had a British name. So there are lots of possibilities open, but actually things are being channeled in to this colonial data machine, which is controlling nature. So Sunil, I mean, over to you on that. I mean, because the weather is really central to your argument. And I just wonder whether, I think that there's a similarity in the way you think about the plotting of the Indian Ocean and also the plotting of India and the Indian subcontinent itself in your argument about weather. And so what's different then in the later period to the one here of Madras Observatory in the early 19th century?
It's interesting because I think the link, the Madras Observatory becomes really crucial to precisely, the number crunching, the data collection that begins to illuminate the mechanisms of the monsoon in more sophisticated ways, in more and more sophisticated ways by the later 19th century. And one of the big shifts that I see is, in fact, a shift, if you like, from the ocean to the land, which is to say that I think that one of the big concerns initially is with forecasting storms, because that was so essential to shipping. And of course, shipping is so essential to keeping imperial networks together. But increasingly, it's not cyclones that are the primary concern, but really averages, average rainfall, average dates of monsoon onset. It's a much more sort of agrarian set of concerns, which requires more and more data. So, I mean, you're right. And you see a multiplication of weather monitoring stations by the end of the 19th century, particularly after the famines of the 1870s. You see a massive expansion of that infrastructure. And I mean, I think the relationship between climate and control is really interesting, because on the one hand, millions of people die in those famines of the 1870s, not just in South Asia, but really across the global South. And as we know, climate is in a way used as a fallback. The idea that these famines were somehow natural or inevitable, that they were simply a natural consequence of monsoon failure. And of course, as we know from, I think, many generations of work, in fact, going back to the late 19th century, there's a very strong political dimension to these famines as well. They dramatize inequality in terms of who's suffering, who is vulnerable. They dramatize the effects of colonial conquest on earlier modes of social security, for want of a better word. So on the one hand, climate is a sort of default explanation for why these famines, these catastrophes are inevitable. On the other hand, the famines themselves, I think, do provoke a certain anxiety on the part of the colonial state. Indeed, the idea that monsoon failure is too unpredictable, that it is precisely the machine that you talked about that needs. So there's this whole story about weather forecasting in India, and the fact that, in the 1890s, the weather forecasts are horrendously wrong. But then there is this fixation, which I think we even see to this day, that, there will be better forecasts, and the main task is to sort of improve the forecasting. But I think that there's a lot of assumptions baked into that about the knowability or the predictability of nature. And eventually there's also a sort of turn towards, I think, a much more infrastructural solution rather than simply a predictive solution, which is to say that even if we can't predict a rainfall, we can engineer the landscape to sort of neutralize that in certain ways. But I wanted to come back to the point about labor. I mean, that amazing image that you showed. One of the things that really strikes me about Waves Across the South is indigenous agency, for want of a better term. I mean, you really are putting the spotlight on individuals and on communities that have very often been written out of, particularly imperial history. And I think in a very moving and powerful way, you bring them out of the shadows precisely by your use of images, amongst other things. And I wonder if you'd say a little bit about how central images are to Waves Across the South, because I mean, this is one thing that really struck me about that. As much as reading the archives in creative ways, which of course you do, you're also looking at images, I think, to try to tell some different stories.
Yeah, sure. So images do play quite a significant role because, of course, for this earlier period, too, one needs to have a diversity of sources to recover these perspectives, images as well as material culture. So the book itself isn't only about South Asia, and we should probably talk about the transnational dimensions in a moment, because Waves Across the South moves to the Pacific and to the South Indian Ocean as well. So it's about the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean together in the late 18th and the early 19th century. And so the category of the indigenous was a way of really bringing together forgotten histories at the edges of these major continents. Certainly the continent of Asia, but also of Africa and Australia in turn, and placing them together and creating a sort of space of solidarity, if you will, for colonized peoples, using and kind of inverting this colonial kind of term of the indigenous. So that was really what I was trying to kind of do with it. And yes, certainly the images were really important to it. To the argument, because say with Aboriginal Australian perspectives being juxtaposed next to South Asian sources and next to the perspectives of Khoisan peoples in South Africa, it was really important not to simply read a certain kind of source in order to create asymmetries between and across those previously unjuxtaposed histories like this. But on images, since you mentioned the Madras Observatory image, I guess the images were also a way then of thinking about the emergence of race and gender into this story. So the Madras Observatory story actually spills over into Southeast Asia, because from Madras Observatory, there's an expedition which I track in the book, which sets off to Sumatra to undertake pendulum length experiments. The pendulum length experiments are just a small part of the book, but I'm going to stick with it to illustrate the point. Off Sumatra to actually, they find this island close to the equator, and it's the perfect spot then for these measurements of the curvature of the Earth. And all of this is going on side by side with the setting up of colonial settlements in Southeast Asia. So effectively, empire is spilling out of Madras to Southeast Asia, but also knowledge is, and the two things are going side by side. And as that occurs, labor is being visually represented through racial and ethnographic means. And so the after history of Madras Observatory, which I track, is the building of a lighthouse close to Singapore, but also the ethnographic work of thinking through the relations between climate and labor and race in Southeast Asia, with the early history of British Singapore, for instance. So really that, there is this data machine, but the data machine is ever expansive, and it's always spilling over, and it's actually politically really central. We don't think about whether science is such a politically weighted thing, but it's really at the heart of empire. And so that kind of leads me then into my question to Sunil, which is really about geopolitics, because this is a major aspect of Sunil's book, which is the relationship between India and China in the 20th century, and the way that plays into the status of South Asia as a frontier for climate, effectively, and also as a frontier for resources, arguably. So if in Waves Across the South, in my account, this is the Age of Revolutions, the Anglo-French rivalry, which is the framework for my history of the Bay of Bengal, or for my history of the Tasman Sea, because the political tussles of the era actually generate and are related to some of the local resonances, if you will, though they don't determine them totally. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the geopolitics and why it's important not simply to look at India in order to understand India's climate and water history.
In many ways, I think there are sort of, if I think about the two ends of my story chronologically speaking, it's in the middle that you see the sort of emergence of a much more bounded and territorial vision of what India is. And I was struck by the fact that the phrase the Indian subcontinent really comes into common usage only in the early 20th century. And it comes into use in part because of this reorientation to thinking about India not so much in maritime terms, but very much more in sort of, subcontinental terms, for want of a better word. And then, in a sense, by the end of my story, partly as a result of environmental transformations, partly as a result of the climate crisis, it becomes imperative to see South Asia in relation, particularly if you think through the medium of the Himalayan rivers to East and Southeast Asia as well. So, in some ways, the question is, what attitudes to nature or what forms of knowledge map onto geopolitical categories at different moments in time? And I think this is one of the things that sort of continues to strike me. So the second part of my book, maybe the last third or so, deals with the long period of decolonization, really coming up to the late 20th or early 21st century. And the thing that strikes me is that in the 50s, even up to the 1962 border war between India and China, there's very little discussion of water, for example. There were a few interesting archival sources in the Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the mid-50s where someone has raised the question, do you think water is going to become a source of conflict in the future? And the Indian Foreign Ministry officials write back saying no, that there is no possibility of either China or indeed India ever intervening in the upper reaches of these rivers. And so, of course, this is what fundamentally changes in the 1980s. And I think that's one of the points of the pivotal points in my book, is that sort of shift around the 1980s when the Chinese government begins to start to dam the Tibetan Plateau, and the Indian government starts to have ambitions to dam the upper reaches of the Himalayan rivers. And then that becomes truly trans-regional. The same thing is happening in Nepal and Bhutan and Pakistan as well, with consequences that we are, of course, seeing playing out around us. But it's not a linear story. I mean, I think this is the thing that I wanted to try to flag in the book. This is one of the reasons why your work on the earlier period is just so generative for me as well. It's sort of thinking about, paths not taken, as well as trying to tell a sort of overarching story of either imperial history or indeed a kind of, human domination, conquest of nature type story. I mean, I think there are sort of cracks in both of those stories over the longue durée, which, maybe both of our books are sort of looking for. And I wanted to think about that question of human agency. And one of the things that really strikes me about Waves Across the South is the presence of the non-human. And by that, I don't just mean the water, but also animals. And I know that animal history is a field that you've written on at various moments in your career. And I would love to hear a little bit more about, how animals feature in the story that you're trying to tell. And perhaps more broadly, what you think the importance is of us all paying more attention to animal history.
Yeah, thank you, Sunil, for that. So I've recently written this piece, which came after Waves Across the South, which was trying to track the origins, really, of the COVID-19 pandemic, but not in terms of going to China and looking for details, but actually in terms of animal-human relations around the pangolin, in particular in South Asia, and arguing that our present moment of the pandemic arises out of really long-term and changeable and accelerating engagements between the human and the animal. At various points, colonial and post-colonial and indigenous and non-indigenous as well. So in Waves Across the South, the way the animals come in is partly off the coast of Tasmania, where Aboriginal women swimming with seals was really central to this vital industry of the seal industry, which is happening simultaneously and probably just slightly before the whaling industry, which comes in as well. So these are really critical maritime industries. And actually there is a South Asia connection there, because there are indicators that there were South Asian people involved in this as well, partly through acting as laborers on ships and then becoming part of the story. And there's a great deal of South Asian furniture which is arriving in Tasmania very early on, because colonial officers are transitioning from East India Company territories to places like Tasmania too. So there is a South Asia dimension to this. But the point about the animal is that really the complex, or the assembly, if you will, of the Aboriginal woman and the seal swimming together, and then in turn, the role of these colonial men in killing these creatures really sort of highlights that all of this needs to kind of come together to create something like the sealing industry. And the status of the Aboriginal woman needs to be factored in, because the changing kind of position of the Aboriginal woman, the way she pushes the story, what happens when Aboriginal people are rounded up, for instance, in Tasmania, in the run-up to the genocide that unfolds there. All of this sort of is related then to the sealing industry. So effectively, from the non-human, one can go into the depopulation of Tasmania for humans as well as non-humans, and into one of the most horrific incidents of colonialism in the early 19th century. So I think we need more histories elsewhere like this as well. And I think Sunil's work certainly is really important in this. And I think there are lots of scholars now working on animal studies in order to do this, in order to think about really the creation of the human subject as they engage with nature through the human relationship with animals, which troubles the status of the human subject. And then in turn, how that relationship has been critical as one of the pathways to this moment where we're seeing huge numbers of extinctions, certainly in our present world. So certainly I think that's a way forward for the work that we are doing. So Sunil, you traveled very widely in writing this book, and you also recovered a whole series of very interesting people, including engineers, technicians, and weathermen, and so forth. So I just wonder whether you could reflect a little bit on the stories that you recovered of these bureaucrats and technicians, who sometimes are not the most sexy people for historians to write about, but I'm really interested in them as well. So why should we pay attention to expertise and to technicians today, I guess, especially in relation to the study of climate?
I mean, I think this is a really interesting question. So in some ways, it was a departure from my previous book where, if you like, the protagonists were mostly migrant workers, workers who worked on the plantations, and I'd done a lot of oral history and spent a lot of time talking to them. And in a way, turning from migrant workers in the early 20th century to water engineers was a shift, though I'd sort of worked on experts earlier in my career when I did my first project on the history of public health. And I think it's interesting to think about experts if we can move beyond either simply celebrating their achievements in a sort of heroic narrative, or, you know, the other extreme, to sort of see them simply as agents of environmental destruction or of imperial control. I mean, I think what's interesting about them is precisely the complexity of their lives, the complexity of their encounters with the environments that they go to study, the unexpected turns in their careers. I mean, you know, one of the striking characters in the archival work that went into Unruly Waters, again, back to the Madras Observatory, is that, in fact, a woman was in charge of the weather monitoring apparatus for all of Madras presidency. Her name was Isis Pogson, and in fact, her father had been head of the Madras Observatory, but she started off in a very menial data collecting sort of role, and eventually ended up sort of heading the entire weather monitoring apparatus, really stretching from the coast of Orissa right down to Kerala at some point. And there are very few traces of her work in the archives. In many ways, this was there were as many questions in my mind as anything I was able to discover. But you know, race and gender come into this in very interesting ways. She's a white woman in a colonial scientific apparatus, working in a field which I think, meteorology, which was struggling for status and respectability in many ways. Meteorology was dismissed very often, particularly in the metropolis, as a science of mere observation. And I think there was this tug, really, between all of those different facets that I think just make the story a little bit more complex than we might end up with if we just pinned a single identity onto these experts, these engineers. I mean, what about in Waves Across the South? I mean, clearly there are many experts of various levels, if you like, in the book. And how did you see their role? Are there any that struck you in particular?
I suppose in asking the question, I was actually wondering about how, certainly at the minute, we need to listen to experts more, because there's all this criticism around the status of expertise. So I think we probably need histories which attend, like yours does beautifully, actually, to the history of expertise, though they're not the most colorful historical figures. We need to think about really the changeable status of the expert on the climate as she or he. Usually it was he, but that's really fascinating that there was a woman in the Madras Observatory story as well, as they sort of, you know, meet the state, as they, you know, do diplomacy on the international stage and so forth. So I guess this is really important history, given the climate crisis that we're in the midst of. In my case, yeah, certainly, I mean, just to stick with Madras Observatory, because I've slightly unpacked that story. So J.T. Thompson is another surveyor who turns up here, who's well known in Singapore, of course, because he's the man who helps lay the streets of early Singapore. And he, you know, is totally troubled by water spouts whilst building lighthouses. And he draws all these images of water spouts. And that's quite, you know, he's certainly a colonial figure, and he's totally trying to tame nature and trying to build a lighthouse which will help the trade between India and China. But he's also a human being, really struggling to come to terms with the natural environment, which is beyond the predicted models in which he's operating. So I think that actually sort of chimes with some of what you've been writing in Unruly Waters as well. So I guess approaching these experts, certainly as people who are like data crunching and modeling and doing all this stuff, which we sometimes don't find very interesting, but really as human beings too, who in turn are reliant on indigenous laborers and men and women to do their work for them, and scribes and so forth as well. Thinking about Abdullah bin Abdul Qadir, for instance. So I think this is a Singapore intellectual of the period. So I think really approaching their histories not as the single men who were geniuses, but rather as these frail human beings who really were very surprised at what was unfolding around them in terms of monsoon and so forth, and then in turn reliant on labor, which they were then, the laborers, who they were trying to discipline and failing to discipline in various ways, including through racial schemes. Thompson, by the way, later relocates, which is telling for the Waves Across the South story, to New Zealand, where he becomes Surveyor General. So that story, once again, is the Pacific and Indian story, Indian Ocean story, connected up.
So we've come to the last 5 minutes of our conversation. I wondered if we could actually end with, I suppose, the really big question. Both of us, I think, at some level have been motivated to write these books by a concern with what we're living through, what our children will live through in relation to the climate crisis. And there's a very moving moment, I think, towards the end of Waves Across the South, where you talk about swimming in the public beach in Mauritius and just sort of suddenly being struck by the risk, by the threats that lie ahead for island societies like Mauritius, and to some extent for all of us. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit about how that has been shaping your imagination as a historian in this book and perhaps even going forward.
Yeah, so the last research that I did for Waves Across the South was in Mauritius, and it was very moving to be there, because a lot of the history of the late 18th and early 19th century is still there. There are still lots of sugar plantations, and some of the sugar plantations are owned by some of the same people from the same families. But the pollution has gone up, and people are worried about the ocean because there are stories of how this heavy cultivation has actually polluted the ocean in turn. So really sort of thinking through, this is not a long gone history, it's still with us, and it's led into our present moment. And if we're to contend with the climate crisis, we need a whole range of histories which present indigenous perspectives, which present experts, which present the history of animals. And those might actually drive some of us as we campaign, as we engage with this issue going forward. But Sunil, let me put the same question to you, really. Where do you see the future of historical writing in an age of climate crisis?
I can only echo, I think, that what you've just said about the need for a whole range of different histories, also on different scales. I mean, I think, we need books like yours, which are connecting a vast swathe of ocean. We need the kinds of local histories that both you and I have learned a lot from, and the kinds of works that, our students and others are doing. I do feel like it's a very creative moment for historical writing. I think a lot of disciplinary boundaries are being transgressed because they have to be. I think only by doing so can we really ever grasp the magnitude of the climate crisis, but also the question of how we got here, which I think is at the back of all of our minds when we're trying to write these histories. I don't think that the only approach is to write something that is specifically calls itself environmental history. I mean, I think it's more about bringing nature, the non-human, a whole range of indigenous perspectives into writing history writ large, which is why, your book is about it's about the waves, it's about climate, it's about nature, it's about the age of revolutions as well. I mean, I think we need to be moving across those levels between the political and the environmental on many different timescales, from the very longue durée to far more compressed periods of history where we see these really transformative changes taking place that, as you say, we still live with. So this has been a great pleasure, Sujit.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. I'm going to wave the books up. Unruly Waters is here, and Waves Across the South. There we go.
Thanks, Suraj.
Thank you, Sujit, and thank you, Sunil, for this enlightening conversation. It was a delight to hear you both. We would love to receive you in person next year for Jaipur Literature Festival 2022. But thank you very much for being part of the virtual festival this year. We'd also like to thank our celebration partner, Diageo, and thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We'd love for you to support us at Teamwork Arts Any contribution is welcome and would help spread knowledge and ideas seamlessly against all odds. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 @Jaipur Lit Fest. Remember, the festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you in the next session. Thank you very much.